everybody, and good evening. Today, welcome to our John Millington Synge lecture, our annual lecture, to which Matthias Fleckenstein, the president of the German-Irish Association, will give a brief introduction.
Yeah, good evening and a very, very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the German-Irish Association of Würzburg. We are delighted to co-host today's John Millington Synge lecture together with ISWÜ, Irish Studies Würzburg. 4 years ago now, we could celebrate not only John Millington Synge's 150th birthday, but also the official inauguration of Irish Studies Würzburg. And over these 4 years, Ireland had a strong return to the academic life at Würzburg University, with lectures, conferences, and other activities in different fields of research and teaching. The links between Würzburg and Ireland started more than 1300 years ago with the Irish monk St. Kilian and his companions. Actually, this is the oldest recorded link between our two countries. And they are still full of energy today with a number of school exchanges. Würzburg's twinning with Bray and County Wicklow celebrating the 25th anniversary next week with more than 50 Irish guests and many more well-established German-Irish relations in the region. Last autumn, a new Irish Consulate General opened in Munich, and I'm delighted and thankful that we see a strong interest and support from this side and also get financial support for this lecture. Great to see Tara Baines from the Consulate among the participants of the lecture tonight. John Millington Synge came to Würzburg in 1894 as a student of music, but after a short period he decided to give up music and go back to Ireland to start something new. We know him now as one of Ireland's greatest playwrights, but he was also a pioneer of photography, and it is fascinating to see the parallels between his perspective as a playwright and as a photographer. In 2014, the German-Irish Association of Würzburg curated and presented Synge's photographs in an exhibition for the first time in Germany. And one of the treasures among my own books is my wallet of photographs, a collection of his photographs published on the occasion of Synge's 100th birthday in 1971. So here it is. And these are the pictures. You can imagine that I'm very much looking forward to Professor Paige Reynolds' lecture and contribution to our series of John Millington Synge lectures, telling us about Synge the photographer. And on behalf of the German-Irish Association of Würzburg, I would like to thank Irish Studies Würzburg, especially Maria Eisenmann, Ina Bergmann, and their dedicated students team for all their enthusiasm and commitment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias, for this introduction. Yes, and for me, it is a real pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Paige Reynolds, who joins us from the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. And Professor Reynolds is the leading voice in modernist studies, drama and performance, and modern and contemporary Irish literature. She is the author of Modernism in Irish Women's Contemporary Writing, The Stubborn Mode, from just recently published, 2024, and Modernism, Drama and the Audience for Irish Spectacle from 2007. And she has edited several influential volumes, including The New Irish Studies and Irish Literature in Transition, Volume 6. She just told me, also involved in an exhibition on romance fiction in the Museum of Literature in Ireland, which will open in July this year. So today she invites us on a journey through words and images as she explores the photographic work of John Millington Synge, also Eudora Welty, and Luis Alberto Rodriguez. And under the title Moving Through the Scene, Openly and Invisibly, drawn from Welty's own reflections on photography, Professor Reynolds will show us how these artists captured the textures of rural life across different times and places. And from early 20th century Ireland to Depression era Mississippi, and all the way to contemporary Wexford. A very warm welcome to you, Paige, and the virtual floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Like Ina and Maria and Matthias have all done such an amazing and warm job of welcoming me, and also such an impressive job with this program, which has a global presence and isn't an easy thing to do in a moment when so many things are competing for our attention. So I have all kinds of respect and also appreciation for the work that you're doing. So today for today's talk, I'm going to pull up my images very quickly. Okay, so this talk has been a really fun opportunity to move back to something that I realized I actually had written my MA thesis centuries ago on, which was Stieglitz's photography and what that meant to modernism. So it's been a real pleasure to return to this, a kind of dive back into the world of modernism and photography. So to frame my talk today, I want to start with the term moving in today's title. A great deal of my recent work has explored what happens when we move across what long have been understood as delimited literary historical periods. In particular, I spent a great deal of time thinking about how the forms, themes, and history of early 20th century high modernism play out in contemporary Irish writing and performance. And I'm not alone in this work, right? A lot of Irish studies criticism and Irish literary criticism moves between times, as you can see in Ina and Maria's new collection, History and Stories, the Irish Past and the Challenges of the Present, right? So that dynamic relationship across time periods. But like many other scholars, I've also been thinking about what unfolds when we move across spaces. Mobility, for instance, was a key theme in the collection, The New Irish Studies. In the recently published collection, Transnationalism in Irish Literature and Culture from 2024, Colleen Parsons rightly observes, quote, "It is, as a practical matter, almost impossible to conceive of Irish cultural production outside transnational, comparative, global, or planetary frames. The borders of nation and state, already contested on the island itself, no longer serve as sufficient hermeneutic boundaries in a world of ideas and forms that travel widely and rapidly." This isn't really news to people who study Synge. For over a century, scholarship has usefully examined both styles of movement, temporal and spatial, in order to understand Synge's inspiration and aesthetic, whether in biographies that highlight his travels in Europe and Ireland, such as Stevens and Green's original, or Bill McCormick's, or in accounts of the ways he moved between historical periods, through his negotiation of the modern and primitive, as you see in Sinead Garrigar-Mather's work, or the edited collection of Maria McGarity and Claire Culleton, or between literary historical modes such as modernism and romanticism, which Sean Hewitt and Nikki Green have both explored. Today, I want to contribute to those conversations by juxtaposing the work of Synge with the American writer Eudora Welty, moving across historical periods, nations, and in today's lecture, artistic forms, in order to consider what new things these types of movements show us. So anyone in attendance will likely know the rough outlines of the biography of John Millington Synge. Born in 1871 in Rathfarnham to a wealthy Protestant family, Synge as a young man studied music and languages in Europe, right? Included, as mentioned, studying music at Würzburg. And I actually have a picture, if we have time, of the aunt that he traveled with to arrive there. In 1896, while in Paris, Synge famously met Yeats, who encouraged him to visit the Aran Islands. In 1898, he took his first of several trips there, as well as to other sites in rural Ireland, which would figure famously in his writing. He helped to direct the Irish National Theatre Society in Dublin with Yeats and Gregory, with this company evolving into what we know today as the Abbey Theatre. He authored 6 plays, along with other works of prose and poetry, and these plays remain among the most studied and performed in the canon of English language literature. He died in 1909 at age 37 from Hodgkin's disease. In 1909, the same year that Synge passed away, the American writer Eudora Welty was born in Jackson, Mississippi. Welty was a short story writer, novelist, and memoirist whose work largely detailed life in the American South during the 20th century, oftentimes through Gothic elements and humor. She generally focused on small town and rural life and centered both Black and white characters. Perhaps best known for oft anthologized short stories such as The Worn Path and Why I Live at the P.O., she won a Pulitzer for her novels The Optimist's Daughter in 1972. Welty traveled a great deal and reviewed anonymously for the New York Times Book Review, but she lived in Jackson until her death at 91 in 2001. As a brief aside to some of my to help ground my future claims, it's important to note here that Welty had a deep connection with Irish writing. She drew the title of her story collection, The Golden Apples, from 1949, from Yeats's poem, The Song of Wandering Angus. And she had a robust relationship with the writer Elizabeth Bowen, to whom she dedicated her collection of short stories, The Bride of Innisfallen and Other Stories, from 1955. She had traveled to Ireland in 1951, where she spent time with Bowen and Mary Lavin. As well, the literary agent who discovered her was Dermot Russell, the son of George Russell, whose 1946 edited collection, The Portable Irish Reader, included Synge's Riders to the Sea, along with an array of other Irish writers, as you can see. While born in Mississippi, Welty attended the University of Wisconsin as an undergraduate and then briefly attended Columbia. And in 1941, she wrote Russell about her deep readings of Irish literature while at Wisconsin. This is an excerpt from the letter. I can't tell you, and it is not needed to, what it was like to me to read A.E., but it was a little like first waiting on the shore and then being enveloped in a sea, not being struck by a wave, never a shock, and it was the same every day, a tender and firm and passionate experience that I felt in all my ignorance, but with a kind of understanding. She also talks about her love of Irish literature and its influence on her writing in her memoir, One Writer's Beginning, from 1983. So these are very brief introductions to these writers, but when you begin to scratch the surface of their biographies and their work, other obvious affinities emerge. For example, Synge was a central, if contentious, figure in the Irish literary revival and committed to its endeavors to elevate Irish history and culture. His invocation of Irish language, myth, and folklore was intended in part to combat demeaning and demoralizing colonial representations of Irish identity. Likewise, Welty in her fiction challenged popular stereotypes of Southern American identity, seeking, like other writers from the American South, including William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, and Zora Neale Hurston, to elevate Southern writing through complex and sensitive representation of the region's setting and subjects. Both endeavored to give voice to the experiences of marginalized people, even as they were outsiders to the communities they represented in their creative work. Their writing shares numerous themes and interests, among them the nature of labor, the contours of rural poverty, and the distinctive aspects of region and life. So this is just one example, I think, of two photos juxtaposed that give you a sense of kind of some of the similar motifs that show up in their photography, right? So here are women working to create cloth materials, right? And then this next one is just celebrations and gatherings, right? So we have a photograph of women at an October fair, and with the Welty picture, we have tomato packers taking a break and listening to a guitar performance. Another interesting link between the two of them that Maren Linnett has looked at is the representation of disability and disabled people with disabilities. So with the Blind Weaver picture, she does a really interesting riff on that that's worth taking a look at. So the particular affinity that I want to hone in on today is their shared commitment as writers to the art of photography, and then to consider how their commitment to this medium shaped their thematics, focusing in particular on how and why what we might call the photographic unconscious is deployed in Synge's The Playboy of the Western World from 1907 and Welty's short story Powerhouse from 1941. I have about a million things to say here about the connections between these two works, but it seems to me that their early firsthand experiences with photography ultimately triggered an enhanced appreciation of live performance. Photography gave them a sense of what goes missing when you can demonstrate only photography gives them a sense of what goes missing, the things that you can see only and experience only through words and bodies and extemporaneity. So Playboy and Powerhouse are in some ways compensatory, powerfully inspired by their work as photographers, while also showcasing the tricky problems that work identified and captured. So the question is, who were they as photographers? At the turn of the century, Synge spent 5 summers in the Aran Islands, honing his Irish, collecting folklore, and taking photographs. In 1898, he bought his first camera there from a tourist while on Inishmore. This is a picture of that camera, of that model, which was among the early handheld cameras making photography widely available to the public, right? So this is his first, the brown one is his first camera, and the black one is his second camera that he had. Between 1898 and 1905, he took photographs while traveling in Connemara, Wicklow, and West Kerry. And roughly 50 of these pictures are now in the library at Trinity College, Dublin, which has restored and digitized them, so you can actually see them for yourself. These photographs, as well as Synge's reliance on the typewriter to draft his written work, a unique practice at the time, according to his early biographer, John Masefield, place him at the fore of artists using new technologies to represent older forms of experience. He also took pictures of Dublin street scenes, and these have been studied by Justin Carville, whose work on Synge and photography is fantastic. But most of his photos center on more primitive ways of life in rural areas. Synge's study, the Aran Islands, which he labeled my first serious piece of work, reveals the dynamic relationship between writing and visual media baked into his thinking. Completed in 1901, the first edition of the Aran Islands was published in 1907 with black and white illustrations by Jack B. Yates, many of which were based on Synge's photographs. So you can see, I think, in this juxtaposition of one of Synge's watercolored etchings, and I'm sorry, one of Yates's watercolored etchings and one of Synge's photographs, right? Already this idea of what happens when you move between genres, right? So that there's a kind of conflation almost of these two characters, as James McArdle points out in this image that Yates creates. But you can also, as Elaine Sison has pointed out, see the influence of European culture on Yates's representation of this Irish vagrant, so that he looks almost, as Sison argues, more like a kind of like European flaneur, right, than he does like a vagrant from the West. So this movement back and forth between genre, between spaces is everywhere in Synge's work. In 1971, a century after Synge's birth, the collection My Wallet of Photographs was published, a book of his photographs organized by Lilo Stephens, the wife of Synge's uncle and biographer, Edward M. Stephens, right? And this is the book that Matthias showed us at the very beginning in his introduction. This collection includes photographs of Wicklow, Dublin, the Blasket, and Aran Islands. And as Stephen notes in her introduction, the gathered photographs are striking in their attention to people rather than scenery. The publication date of this collection is another uncanny bit of synergy between these two writers, as Welty's first published collection of photographs, titled One Time, One Place, was also published in 1971. In 1933, Welty began working as a publicity agent for the Works Progress Administration, a government employment program during the New Deal that provided work to millions of Americans following the 1929 stock market crash. And this is her camera. While working for the WPA, Welty collected interviews and stories from individuals in the South, and the images collected in One Time, One Place were taken from among several hundred photographs that she took as she documented life in Mississippi during the Depression. During these years, the formal and informal racial segregation and disenfranchisement of the Jim Crow era was in effect, and Welty moved among and between white and Black communities, documenting their everyday practices and giving particular attention to the rural poor. Both amateur photographers, Synge and Welty, regarded their photographs as a testimonial to the realities of life. As Synge wrote in the Aran Islands, "In the pages that follow, I have given a direct account of my life on the islands and of what I met among them, inventing nothing and changing nothing that is essential." Likewise, Welty described One Time, One Place by writing of her photographs. Taken all together, they cannot help but amount to a record of a kind, a record of fact, putting together some of the elements of one time and one place. She continued, "A better and less ignorant photographer would certainly have come up with better pictures, but not these pictures, for he could hardly have been as well positioned as I was, moving through the scene openly and yet invisibly, because I was part of it, born into it, taken for granted." Both Synge and Welty think critically about their status as immersive photographers, the push and pull of intimacy and distance of their positions in relation to the communities they document. Photography as art and practice gives testament to the limits of any imagined sense of belonging. The photographer stands outside the activity, picks a focus, and removes himself or herself to frame and document it. Nevertheless, the contradictory ambition of moving through the scene open and yet invisibly appears throughout their accounts of photography. And I want to argue today that it informs their writing. This uneasy state of being a wealthy Protestant cosmopolitan urban writer in rural Ireland or a middle-class Catholic white woman in rural Mississippi. So if I started the talk by digging into the term moving, now I want to think about the words openly and invisibly. As this photograph of Welty and later in her life demonstrates, the role of a photographer means that you always stand outside the action, observing with a machine in your hand that separates you from your subject and allows you to frame and thus control the reality you seek to record. And as James Carville notes in his illuminating study of My Wallet of Photographs, quote, on the one hand, photography is employed to establish the photographer's modernity and position of power over the ethnographically observed. And on the other, it is required to make the ethnographic observer socially acceptable to the indigenous culture. In his prose, Synge's accounts of photographs confirm this paradox, demonstrating that moving openly and invisibly among your subjects is impossible and maybe even a problem. For him, photographs are often associated with his being too visible, as seen in this famous passage from which the title of My Wallet of Photographs is taken. As a mass of sobbing pigs was being transported by curraghs to a steamer, Synge observed at the upset crowd who heard and witnessed this traumatic event. Quote, the women were overexcited, and when I tried to talk to them, they crowded around me and began jeering and shrieking at me because I'm not married. A dozen screamed at a time and so rapidly that I could not understand all they were saying. Yet I was able to make out that they were taking advantage of the absence of their husbands to give me the full volume of their contempt. Some little boys who were listening threw themselves down, writhing with laughter among the seaweed, and the young girls grew red with embarrassment and stared down into the surf. For a moment, I was in confusion. I tried to speak to them, but I could not make myself heard. So I sat down on the slip and drew out my wallet of photographs. In an instant, I had the whole band clambering around me in their ordinary mood. Throughout accounts of his photographs, Synge considers the utilitarianism of these objects as much as their capacity for representation. Here, the images are a form of currency, right, literally coming out of his wallet, that allow him to direct the attention of the locals and to manage them, to buy their attention. But he's also anxious about the potential loss of that attention, as seen in another moment from the Aran Islands, where he says, or where he writes, I know so little of their ways of fishing and farming that I do not find it easy to keep up our talk without reaching matters where they cannot follow me. And since the novelty of my photographs has passed off, I have some difficulty in giving them the entertainment they seem to expect from my company. Today, I showed them some simple gymnastic feats and conjurer's tricks, which gave them great amusement. Synge's nod to magic here is important. It's a reminder of that term magic lantern that described early image projectors. His association with magic here points to the slipperiness of the image, the deliberate misrepresentation it might allow and even encourage. And in both cases, the magic allows Synge to dodge the challenges of talk. The performance is stickier than the fixed images, right? So that they are looking and then he draws their attention and it might go away. In another anecdote that associates photography with magic, Synge seems worried that tricks undermine the ideal promise of reality promised by his photographs, the idea that what you see is what you get. Here, he documents an encounter with Martine McDonough, called by the pseudonym Michael in the book, that plays with his anxiety. One day, I alluded to my trick of joining string. You can't join a string, don't be saying it, he said. I don't know what way you're after fooling us, but you didn't join that string, not a bit of you. We nearly quarreled because he wanted me to take his photograph in his Sunday clothes from Galway, instead of his native homespuns that become him far better. though he does not like them, as they seem to connect him with the primitive life of the world. With his keen temperament, he may go far if he can ever step out into the world. He is constantly thinking. So this is Martine, having been convinced to wear his homespuns instead of his Galway suit. And again, sort of being asked by or encouraged by Synge to perform through costume, right? His rural identity as opposed to his sort of more quote unquote westernized or modernized Galway suit. In this account of magic, the artful misrepresentation of reality, this is another account of, here's another account of magic, the artful misrepresentation of reality that segues again into an account of photography. Though in this instance, it also aligns with Michael's calculated desire to change his costume, to dress in his Sunday clothes from Galway that align him with the world rather than his native home. Each of these anecdotes suggests that openly and invisibly is impossible for Synge. As a photographer, he is also always a magician, spinning reality to suit himself and his ambitions. For Welty, the notion that you can move openly and invisibly is equally undermined. In her introduction to One Time, One Place, she writes, quote, "It will be evident that the majority of them, the pictures, were snapped without the awareness of the subjects or with only their peripheral awareness. These ought to be the best, but I'm not sure they are. The snapshots made with people's awareness are, for the most part, just as unposed. I simply asked people if they would mind going on with what they were doing and let me take a picture. I can't remember ever being met with a demurrer stronger than amusement." And then parentheticals, "The lady bootlegger, the one in the fedora with the drawn back ice pick, was only pretending to drive me away. It was a joke. She knew I hadn't come to turn her in." End quote. But here, Welty as a photographer is a performer too. She aggressively insists on her amateur status, like Synge, that she is because like Synge, she is one of many who now has ready access to a handheld camera, the precursor to our own modern day camera phones, which go with us everywhere. And she expressed reservations about how her contemporaries, Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange, staged their documentary photographs. But Welty isn't entirely real about the conditions of her own photographs. Keep in mind, she worked in the American South during the 1930s, where a Black person even making eye contact with a white person could invite violent retribution. So it's not clear her subjects had that much choice in having their pictures taken, and her understanding of their level of comfort may well reflect her own sense of racial entitlement enabled by the failings of America and its history. So in this last move, I want to pull the term scene from my title as a place where an incident or action occurs in a work of drama or fiction. And to do this, I just want to pause for a second, show you a few more pictures, starting here with some images, again, from Synge's My Wallet of Photographs. What's striking, I think, both about Welty and Synge and their photographs is that they're almost always on the outside, right? So that there are very few, if any, and I actually don't even think with Synge there are any, but there are very, very few pictures of the inside spaces of the people whom they are photographing. And these are two examples of a kind of mundane photograph of a woman and child at Pat McDonough's cottage, where the next one on the right is actually traumatic, right? This is actually a picture of individuals who have been evicted from their homes. And there are actually a lot of 19th century photographs of evictions. So, we know there aren't any photographs of the famine, but there are a surfeit of pictures as this new media developed, taken by the press or by individuals of evictions in Ireland. So it's just interesting to see Synge kind of carrying that thread forward. So in this final, so I'm going to take you from the outside because my argument is going to be that the plays take us inside. In this final portion of my lecture, I want to suggest that in Synge's tragicomedy, The Playboy of the Western World, and Welty's short story, Powerhouse, both works focus on live embodied performance. And it's because these writers take lessons about authenticity and identity that were provoked by their photography and explore them in these fictional depictions of live embodied performance. Susan Sontag has famously considered the moral implications of photographing the bleak and ugly aspects of human experience, arguing that these images have created a sense of dissociation in viewers. Synge and Welty seem in these written works to anticipate her concern, using other media as a complement to untangle the complex stories that can be not be told in a still image of a photograph. At the heart of these fictional narratives for Synge and form and Welty and content are real people interacting in shared time and space. I don't think Synge in his travel writing quite knew what to make of the slipperiness between reality and magic, authentic and perform, that was elicited and underscored by photography, as you might have seen in the previous quotes that I provided. But as another example, many of his accounts of sharing his photographs with the locals include him noting the physical touch of a female observer during these encounters, rhetorically linking the photographic image of the body to the real bodies he describes in his prose, right? So he'll show the photographs to a group of people and he'll always note, oh, this woman leaned over my shoulder and touched me. Oh, this woman leaned over in front of me and I felt her. And then I think that Welty likewise kind of similarly struggled with what we now call the presentation of the self in everyday life, right? This sort of famous term from mid-20th century taken from the sociologist Erving Goffman. And we see this in her description of the bootlegger. But we also see it even in her photographs of performances, which I'll give you a couple of here, right? She rarely allows the viewer into the space where the action unfolds, especially when her subjects are Black, right? So her eye is going here to a church performance, right? But she's outside of the actual performance, right? We get the real people in their costumes, but we're not given access to sort of what's going on inside the church performance. Likewise, she has a number of pictures of performances, again, where she, as a white photographer, is outside of it, right? So this would be a theater that would have, because of racial segregation, a colored entrance to all performances, right? So she's standing outside, letting us know these performances are happening, right? But not inviting us into them with her imagery. So to go back to the Playboy of the Western world, this play, as you know, premiered at the Abbey in 1907 and was greeted famously by riots and resistance from its audience, due in large part to Synge's purported misrepresentation of the Irish peasantry. As I imagine everyone here knows, the play opens with the surprising arrival of Christy Mann, a young man who claims to have murdered his abusive father by hitting him over the head with a loy. The locals in the Somalmayo village where he appears embrace the stranger for his purported heroism until his father, old man, appears in the village, very much alive. This betrayal leads the villagers, including his love interest, Pegeen Mike, to violently reject Christy. At the end of the play, Christy and his father reconcile, and they agree to leave Mayo together to tell their stories, abandoning Pegeen Mike, who laments her loss of the only playboy of the Western world. The play concludes in the same shebeen where it began, with Pegeen surrounded by a group of men delighted by the return of equilibrium to their community. Welty's short story center on a Black jazz pianist and the band leader named Powerhouse, who performs with his band for a one night in the fictional town of Alligator, Mississippi. On stage, the musician Powerhouse reports to his band that he's received a telegram from a man named Uranus Knockwood, announcing that Powerhouse's wife, Gypsy, has died. The gruesome report of Gypsy's violent death is then imaginatively recounted by Powerhouse, and it's actually unclear if it ever happened, or even if she's dead, or if Uranus Knockwood exists, or even if there's actually a telegraph that bore this information. Powerhouse references the existence of the actual telegram often, riffing on its content and even offering to pull it out of his pocket and display it, right, like Synge's photographs. But the characters in the story and readers alike never actually know if the telegram exists or if its message is true. So these two, play and story, in both. A stranger arrives in an unfamiliar town. He rivets the locals with a compelling story about a family member who has treated him poorly and died violently. The community derives great pleasure from this story, and the narrative ends with a character who mourns being unloved and unwanted, while an impassive audience continues going about their business without being affected by the loss. Sound familiar? So again, I haven't been able to find any archival evidence that she built this on Playboy, but I am willing to bet my entire academic career, right, on the fact that this story is taken from Playboy. Okay, so another similarity between these works, I would argue, stems from their sharing of photographic unconscious. There are no direct references to photographs or photography in Playboy, but that doesn't mean that Synge's experience as a photographer does not powerfully influence the play, right? So Declan Kyburn and Justin Carville have both talked about the form of photography and its influence on the Aran Islands, but I want to talk today about content on the plays. For example, just as Synge anxiously tries to hold and manage the attention of his rural audiences with his wallet of photographs and then his magic tricks, so too does Christie work to fasten the attention of his audiences with his poetry talk and physical feats as the play moves forward. And in Playboy, as with his photographs, what you see is rarely what you get, and that's the art of the play. Synge has now embraced in this play the uneasy relationship between image as fact and as invention, as when Christie describes seeing Pegeen Mike as, quote, the love light of the star of knowledge shining from her brow, only to have Widow Quinn correct him by asserting, there's poetry talk for a girl you'd see itching and scratching. This is one of many, many instances in the play where the verb see is used by the characters, or when they use metaphors linked to visibility or clouding, as these characters attempt to parse the stories and events unfolding around them. In another example, when Christie first spots his father, Old Man Alive in Mayo, he blurts, it's the walking spirit of my murdered da, right? So he thinks it's a ghost, only to be corrected once again by the Widow Quinn, who looking out at the actual person on the horizon reasonably responds by asking Christie, is that a tramper? So that tension between kind of imagined and real is always at the fore of this play. Synge insisted that his photographs were, quote, a direct account that invented nothing. But in Playboy, the heroic act is accepting and even embracing the confusion between art and reality. But whenever reality, such as when Old Man beats his son in front of the Mayoites, exposing Christie's lie, Pegeen demands that Christie be taken away. She is repeatedly urging others to take him on for this, or take him on from me. That is, get him out of my sight. She refuses art and the evidentiary slipperiness of representation that defines it, choosing the reality of what she witnesses directly. She famously rejects Christie by announcing, quote, I'll say a strange man is a marvel with his mighty talk, but what's a squabble in your backyard and the blow of a loy have taught me that there's a great gap between a gala story and a dirty deed. She, Pegeen, has chosen the direct account that invented nothing promised by the photograph, and it comes at a harrowing loss for her character when she's abandoned by Christie at the play's end and she can no longer see him. Like the three-act Playboy, Welty's short story has a tripartite structure. The first scene depicts the black jazz pianist Powerhouse and his band performing before an all-white audience in a dance hall in the fictional town of Alligator. The second scene, set during the performance's intermission, follows Powerhouse and the band to the World Cafe in Negro Town. And in the third scene, Powerhouse and the band return to the theater to finish their performance. The characters here move around, but stay inside. In the first scene, Welty gives a political edge to the concern about what you see is what you get. The white spectators can see and hear Powerhouse, an enormously talented performer on stage, and nonetheless, they demonstrably do not understand or appreciate him because they are locked into racist biases, cued by what they see on stage and unable to move past prejudicial how prejudicial images encoded in images, the promotional posters, the band's physical appearance, the widespread caricatures of foreign and minoritized people have distorted reality. And you'll see the opening of the story here. Powerhouse is playing. He's here on tour from the city. Powerhouse and his keyboard, Powerhouse and his Tasmanians. Think of the things he calls himself. There's no one in the world like him. You can't tell what it is. Inman? He looks more Asiatic, monkey, Jewish, Babylonian, Peruvian, fanatic, devil. So you can see how all of these perceptions have been formed by the circulation, the kind of mass circulation of two-dimensional images of racial difference. And the white audience, right? Because this is the narrative perspective, right? It's an omniscient third-person narrator, but operating from a racist perspective, right? Kind of captures that in the language, but it comes from pictures. At intermission, when the Black characters move to the World Cafe because they cannot be served at the segregated white dance, the omniscient narrator moves with them. This Black audience, informally gathered in and outside of the cafe, is riveted by Powerhouse's increasingly elaborate tale of Gypsy and Uranus Knockwood. Like the Mayo villagers, this group plays an important role in constructing Powerhouse's tale with their questions and observations. The waitress setting down the, so this is a passage that comes from it when they're inside this Black space, a different kind of performance. The waitress setting the tray of beer down on the back table comes up taut and apprehensive as a hen. Says in the kitchen back there, putting their eyes to little hole peeping out, is that you is Mr. Powerhouse. They knows from a picture they seen. They sing right tonight, that is him, says little brother. You him? That is him in the flesh, says Scoot. Do you wish to touch him, asks Valentine, because he don't bite. You passing through? Now you got everything right. Here, as in the opening scene, another picture defines Powerhouse. But in this perspective, the picture alludes to a celebrity and is not so obviously freighted with racist misperception. In the World Cafe, the scene of collective and interactive storytelling, as with the scenes on stage among the bands and they perform, rewrites the visual politics of photography, the fixed and one-way story of the photograph, right? Where the photograph is here and no matter what you say to it, it's not going to respond. The scene also provocatively recalls the famous anecdote from Synge's preface to Playboy, in which he insists that he learned rural dialects by eavesdropping on his mother's servants from a chink in the floor. Yet another example of attempting to move openly and invisibly, right? Like eavesdropping. And the characters here don't eavesdrop, but instead they watch from a little peeping hole, right? So there's this idea of kind of peeking in on things maybe you're not supposed to hear in Playboy, watching things maybe you're not supposed to see in this story. Without actual evidence of Gypsy's betrayal or death, Powerhouse performs the role of the cuckolded and bereaved husband throughout this story. When the Black server asks Powerhouse for confirmation of the story of Gypsy and Knockwood, he admits, "No, babe, it ain't the truth. Truth is something worse." And when he refuses to validate the content of the telegraph or even its actual material existence, Powerhouse asserts, "Don't make any difference. I gotcha," right? So he's riveted the attention. I caught you. You're listening to me. So Powerhouse refuses the authority of the telegram as an object. There is no wallet of photographs here, right? But his spoken narrative draws the attention he seeks, and as a result, they remain under his authority. Language here is his magic. In the third and final act of Playboy, Christie flies the nets of Mayo, announcing, 10,000 blessings upon all that's here, for you've turned me a likely gaffer in the end of all, the way I'll go romancing through a romping lifetime from this hour to the dawning of Judgment Day. But in the third act of Welty's short story, Powerhouse and his band return to the enclosed and segregated space of the white dance, and the story to a racist narrative perspective that abstracts him. The story concludes with Powerhouse once again performing on stage, and these are the final lines. They've requested Somebody Loves Me, and he's already done 12 or 14 choruses, piling them up, nobody knows how, and it'll be a wonder if he ever gets through. Now and then he calls and shouts, "Somebody loves me, somebody loves me, I wonder who." His mouth gets to be nothing but a volcano. I wonder who. Maybe he uses all his right hand on the trill. Maybe he pulls back his spread fingers and looks out upon the place where he is. A vast and personal and yet furious grimace transfigures his wet face. Maybe it's you. This concluding scene seems a powerful merger of the aesthetics of photography and performance, a desire to bring imagined reconciliation and love, personal and social, into being. But as with the photograph, the band's performance does not allow for dialogue or interaction between observer and observed. Despite the dynamism of the performance, Powerhouse receives no answer to a scripted and repeated question, and he remains trapped in the frame of the white narrator's gaze, performing for you, the viewer. The futility of his song and its lyrics thus chime with the anguish of the final words of Playboy, when Pegeen Mike Keene's, "Oh, my grief, I've lost him surely, I've lost the only Playboy of the Western world." Both works end with the image of a victim trapped in a tableau, but also in a pernicious social and cultural environment. Playboy both represents and resists the dark effects of British colonialism and the intractable nature of social and gender inequities. so too does Powerhouse represent and resist the obdurate problems of American racism. I also think that thinking through photography reframes our reading of the Playboy riots, which Synge knew were coming, as a theatrical manifestation of the shock that he instigated in the rural people who had a chance to look at his photographs. If the photographic imagination had infiltrated the Dublin public, the shock of Christie's depiction of women in their shifts seems less of a leap as a problem, particularly given the astonishment that Synge noted from men in West Kerry who looked at old photographs of Synge standing among the classical statues in Paris's Luxembourg Gardens. In this anecdote, the Kerryites confuse art and reality to salacious effect, marveling, quote, "Look at that. In those countries, they do have naked people standing about in their skins," end quote. In this way, Playboy demonstrates that theater and theatrical performance continue to carry the disruptive effects of new technology. If Synge used the lessons of photography to rivet and shock the audiences for Playboy, Welty would use a similar strategy in 1963 when speaking at the Southern Literary Festival at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi. Welty's biographer, Suzanne Mars, reports that the college, which had been hesitant to integrate, invited the now famous Welty, who was a board member there, to deliver a lecture. As a gesture of activism, Welty hosted Black scholars and students from Tougaloo College at the event, where she delivered a fairly non-controversial lecture. But then she read the story Powerhouse, to her integrated audience. A story written from the viewpoint of a white narrator about a dramatic act of violence and betrayal. A story rich with sexual and racist language and stereotypes that would likely shock both parties at the cost of an easy sense of white privilege. So, there's a way in which my lecture today has been a pretty straightforward compare and contrast paper. Another example of the wide-ranging influence of Irish writing on American culture as it moves across time and space from the work of Synge to Welty. Playboy has often been understood through its attention to oral culture and its distinctive Hiberno-English dialogue, due in part to Synge's own insistence of such in the preface. In a similar way, studies of Powerhouse reasonably have focused on the story's jazz and blues aesthetics, which reflect in form and content the improvisational and interactive energies of musical performances. And these are, of course, real and crucial inspirations. But it seems to me that photography also shapes these texts, in part by showcasing the limits of this realistic media form, by insisting on the ways that photographs can flatten experience or turn difference into a spectacle that thwarts rather than stokes empathy in action. The photographs of Synge and Welty are undergirded by a noble mission. They endeavor to bring a neglected population to the public eye. The creative work Synge and Welty produced in the wake of their amateur photography and ethnography suggests that their experience as photographers allowed them to move invisibly and openly across formal and informal divides separating citizens, divides that were linguistic, racial, and economic, as well as religious, among many others. It also allowed them to offer vivid insight into communities and experiences unseen by the privileged with these photographs, introducing their subjects and viewers to new audiences. But again, their photographs and the narrative surrounding them often more fully expose the nature of cultural segregation as both physical and psychological. Photography opens up unfamiliar worlds to viewers, but it also confirms old and even generates new prejudices. Synge and Welty, I would argue, crafted the literary representations of live performance we looked at today in order to display as well as to challenge the limits of photography, to remind us of what goes missing without live bodies, interactive talk, shared time and space. Playboy and Powerhouse endeavor to compensate for the impossibility of moving invisibly and openly into these spaces as photographers, and then they use performance to give readers and theater goers fuller access to the complexities of the human condition. But even as both of these works imaginatively bring readers and theater audiences into these hidden scenes of the experience of marginalized and minoritized subjects, they also demonstrate the implacability of the real-life divides they seek to move across. The inherent contradiction of moving openly and invisibly, the impossibility of this, reflects the impossibility of easily dismantling the instantiated historical divides they seek to dissemble. So I had promised you guys that I would talk about this book, People of the Mud, Louis Alberto Rodriguez's photographs of Wexford, but I also talked for a really long time. So what I was going to do is just sort of briefly pull this up, and then in the Q&A, if people want to talk about it a little more, we can do that. But I think even by looking at these images, you can see the links that Rodriguez has with the work of Synge and Welty, right, as a kind of photographic amateur photographer. He's actually a US and Dominican artist who on a grant, a heritage grant, went to Wexford to take pictures. His background is not photography, his background is dance. And so he has really interesting accounts of as what he described, a brown guy going into the very white world in the south of Ireland on a farm, right? He's like this sort of urban dancer guy with brown skin who's moving into Wexford, hurling circles and farming circles and dance circles. And he talks again about how this idea of moving openly and invisibly. But what's remarkable about his accounts of photography, as opposed to say Welty and Synge, is his canniness about it. You know, the sensitivity with which he and the anxiety with which he went to meet with these locals in Wexford, and then the ways in which they could take him in. But again, the idea of kind of abstracted body parts here, the idea of not seeing faces, right, with the Irish dancer who has her wig on backwards so we can't see her face, or even the kind of physicality and again the hidden faces of these hurlers whom Rodriguez has choreographed in this position among others to sort of stoke questions about masculinity and collaboration and identity. So there's a real continuity that moves even into 2020 of the kind of projects that you see with Synge. So that's my talk.
Thank you very much for this enlightening and great talk and the many photographies that you showed us to compare. And yes, I see people applauding, and the floor is open now for questions, but maybe also for comments if you want to comment on the talk.
So Maria, do you want me to leave these images up or do you want me to stop sharing? It's totally up to you.
I think it depends. Maybe if we have a question on a photograph, it would make sense if you share it again.
Okay, let's leave it up then.
Yeah, so that everybody is in the picture, so to say. Yeah, but if it is a more general question, we probably don't need the pictures. Okay, so the floor is open. Can you show your hands or your artificial hands if you don't show your faces, if you don't use your cameras? Yes, Ina, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very much, Paige, for this intriguing talk. I have a lot of in my head, and I'm about your topics and your comparisons. I don't know if they'll come out in a structured way. We've just had a session of my class on Irish American literature, culture, and history, and many of my students are today, and what that we were starting to think about, and that we'll think together about for the rest of the term is, what is Irish American literature? What is Irish American culture? What are Irish American, texts or media? And I was having a little brainstorming about that, and I don't know, but I would be very interested because I know you have interest in new Irish studies where this idea of the Irish writer and the Irish literature longer nation, and here talk or bound to just the borders of the nation. And here in your talk, you're also, I think, transcending time and space and borders in comparison. So when you say, Irish culture influences American culture and maybe vice versa, would you say, what we are doing here is tonight is American studies, or would we have to have, piece that combines Irish American elements? Since you are on Irish studies. We would be very interested in your thoughts on Irish American studies then.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, I'm always talking about this with friends who aren't in Irish studies, the way in which Celtic studies is sort of its own thing, right? And then there's Irish studies, and then there's also Irish American studies, which has a kind of deep expertise and vocabulary, which I will confess I am not. I mean, I'm familiar with, obviously, as someone in the field, but I'm not an expert on that. So I'm going to be speaking more as somebody who knows a lot about Irish literature and a lot about America rather than someone who knows a lot about Irish American literature. But I do think that, you know, what's remarkable and interesting to me, and again, I'm sure you know this because I saw that she's speaking later for you, but, you know, Kate Costello-Sullivan just helped to edit a collection on Irish America for Routledge. So there's lots of good work out there on precisely this topic. But one of the things I find really interesting is the kind of disconnect between there are a number of things, right? So on one hand, there's a kind of disconnect between the conservatism, the political conservatism of Irish Americans in 21st century America, which we saw remobilized a little bit with the Trump election, and the kind of sense of that standing for a kind of like the good immigrant because it's a white immigrant, right? Who's been here for centuries. So I think the idea of Irish American as a kind of, you know, in a talk that's talking a lot about performance and identity, can be mobilized for really pernicious effect, right? To give a kind of pass to certain kinds of privilege and to erase a really difficult immigrant history, right? So in that way, I think the term Irish American is really complicated and vexing. With Irish American literature, that I think has historically also been a really interesting thing to me, particularly in terms of women writers, right? I mean, this idea of Maeve Brennan, you know, so much of the writing, up to and including Welty's work, was published that was thinking about Ireland, or was an Irish writer thinking about America, was published in The New Yorker. And Maeve Brennan's insight, sort of looking at America kind of from a distance, you know, almost, I mean, it's kind of the same approach, right? A kind of photograph of a scene of American life from a different vantage. The idea of an Irish woman moving openly and invisibly in New York culture, I think, is a kind of motif that runs through a lot of the Irish American writers or Irish writers in America, whom I find particularly interesting. So I think, you know, that's one way I think of kind of tying Irish American literature to the interests of the paper. Does that help?
Yeah, yes, very much. Yeah, I think there's, you know, cross-fertilization between, you know, Ireland and the US. I was thinking of, you know, when I saw Synge's of the Aran people, I was immediately, of course, thinking of, you know, Man of Aran, and then also the Cripple of Inishma, Martin McDonagh, and where it's linked to, you know, this Hollywood production and this of, you know, performing the rural, which is something that you know, comes back to the Eudora Welty quote, basically, where she said, you know, this is not performance. But then on the end, she says, oh, this woman used the ice pick on me. So she was performing. It was not, you know, an authentic moment. And I'm also thinking about Irish players, the Abbey Theatre players throughout their tour at the beginning of 20th century, when they were playing a lot of, or performing a lot of plays in the USA, were influencing basically beginning American drama. Eugene O'Neill and the Provincetown plays, all of them, you know, went to Abbey Theatre.
Yeah, the Little Theatre movement, as you point out, was
yeah.
Yeah, the Little Theatre movement was 100% inspired by what was going on in Ireland and by those tours. And, you know, the tours I think are particularly interesting in the States because it's another example of this kind of choreographing, you know, that you see in the Rodriguez, you know, as well as the kind of performance and costuming that you see in Synge, and Welty, because, you know, those, having seen the riots unfurl, and you know, I'm sure many listeners know this, right? But having seen the riots unfurl in 1907, in Ireland, one of the reasons that the Abbey came over here and performed Playboy the Western World, right, was to kind of stoke those same energies, and attention, so that it would help to support their new theater. And it did financially, right? It got them an enormous amount of press coverage, and it got them enormous amount of, cultural credibility. But it also, I think, sort of, again, helped to sort of put Irish identity at the center of things, both in America, both kind of philanthropically as well as in terms of, again, cultural authority. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting back and forth, and I think part of what you're saying too has to do with the notion of Ireland as a kind of bucolic retreat, right? So within Ireland, right, the west of Ireland represents a kind of place to vacation or tour or access your true Irish identity. The island as a whole, really represents that, I think, in the American imaginary. So it's been interesting, I think, to see the ways in which Irishness has transformed radically in the American imagination. When I'm talking to my students now, Ireland is this incredibly politically progressive space to them. I mean that, it's a place where, you could have a legal abortion, where you can, you'd have same-sex marriage, right? Where there's meaningful support for migrants. I mean, again, none of those are perfect. Like, I'm not sitting here and saying Ireland is a utopia, but what's remarkable to me is the traction of the idea of Ireland as a utopia, even as actual social and cultural conditions on the island radically change, from decade to decade. So I think there's definitely some of that energy, that sort of surfaces in a lot of these works, kind of pushing back on that idealized notion of what Ireland is for Americans.
Yeah, thanks very much.
So don't see any other hands. I would like to ask a question on the photographies you showed us.
Sure.
And building on these, kind of shared themes of rural embodiment. I saw a lot of rural embodiment in there, and also cultural expression across a variety of photographic practices now. My question is, in what ways do you think can photography, and I'm talking about ranging from ethnographic documentation to also performative, maybe visual art, can this serve not only to represent rural communities, but also to actively shape how these communities see themselves and as they are seen by others, like those perspectives that we share?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, what's striking to me as a kind of through line in narratives about photography, trying to capture a rural experience, or even, any experience that's less familiar, right? That's not a sort of urban, or Vogue magazine sort of version of photography, is the way in which it has a kind of, it can have a political edge depending on how it circulates. I think about, the LA riots, when video images of Rodney King were circulated and he was being beaten, or what we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement being stoked by the circulation of photographic images, right? So that if in ways this kind of violence has been enacted on Black bodies for forever, that there's been something I think really interesting, both about the kind of amateur quality of it, right? That we all have phones right now. So we're all amateur documentarians of worlds that other people don't see, right? When I get on and I post on Instagram, like, look where I was this weekend, I'm inviting, people into my experience. And so the ways in which that has been deployed politically in representing sort of things we might not want to see, I think has been really interesting. And I think is part of a kind of longer narrative. I think we think about that as very much a function of the late 20th century and into the present day. And I think what Synge shows us is that from the inception of photography, and, we saw this with Jacob Riis, in early 20th century America, when he would go into tenements, right, and take pictures of these impoverished American and immigrant tenement dwellers, that the idea of the photograph as, literally exposing aspects of human experience that get written out of mainstream narratives, I think is a really important one. And I think what's interesting is to find the through lines between, what's Synge with his boxy handheld camera. Like it's so funny because for this talk, it was the first time I had actually looked to see what his camera actually looked like. Because we all know the sort of, daguerreotype cameras that were just huge and boxy and on their, tripods. But I don't know. I just imagine Synge sort of, running through, the fields in the west of Ireland, with a handheld camera. But the handheld camera is not small. It's clunky. It still takes a long time. So the ways in which even the mechanics of the camera and the act of taking the picture is slow and demands particular kinds of attention that this really doesn't, I find interesting, because they are doing kind of the same thing, right? I want to capture an experience of people who are marginalized, and I want to make them available to a wider public in order to do X, right? Which is generally, in the case of Synge and Welty, right, to sort of build a sense of community and empathy and even regional pride, and the kind of authenticity of the subjects. But it is interesting to me how that kind of association of authenticity in the image holds even today with our phones, right, which are just everywhere. Like I don't think for a second, oh, look, they're staging a picture of themselves at somebody's birthday party, or I don't know. It's just it's such a weird renegotiation of that tension between performance and authenticity, I think, with our phones now. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But maybe just a little bit. Do you think it influences actually the way the photographed people see themselves? Do you know what I mean?
I don't know. I mean, there's an interesting one of the reasons I pulled this picture of knees from the Rodriguez collection is because Synge has a moment in the Aran Islands where he talks about the fact that he would show these pictures of the villagers around, and people could just look at a hand or just a piece of like a sort of a snapshot of just a part of a person's body, and they could identify to whom that body part belonged. So that a knee is a knee is a knee, as in this picture that we're looking up here. But the kind of intimacy and connection and knowingness of such a small rural community for Synge was worth remarking on. So I think in a way, what we see with, the Martine picture when he's wearing his homespuns, is I want to be seen, and I want to be captured, and I want to be reflected as a Galway man about town, but I am also the person in my homespuns. So I think there's something about the kind of freeze frame of that identity and the costume and the appearance that, at least in the cases we saw from that anecdote with Martine, actually had him pushing back against who he was. So I guess the summation of that rambling answer is, one, I think looking at the picture underscores a particular kind of knowingness and intimacy that was available in these isolated small communities, right, that we don't necessarily have in modern urban life. And then I think, two, it also helped in the anecdotes that Synge provides the subjects themselves to be aware of both the fixity as well as the mobility of who they think they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I understand. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would like to ask a completely different question, because coming from ELT, English language teaching, I wonder how we as teachers, university teachers, can make these photographs or use photographs like these that you showed us in kind of a teaching context to encourage students to reflect on identity, belonging, and also maybe representations of rural life. Do you have any idea on that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would actually say is I think in many cases the students are better than we are at that. I mean, they are growing up in an increasingly visual world. one of the sort of traumatic stories of my past year has been joining Instagram. I've never been on any social media platform ever, I find Instagram enormously stressful as well as not particularly interesting, right? But it's a necessary tool, I think, to sort of circulate information. I was looking for sort of a platform where I could keep up with, programs like what you guys do, that there's a way that those kind of communities and connections and nodes of interest, I think are really important. And the fact that on Instagram, they're so incredibly visual, and that's the platform that students really like. But I do think what's interesting to me is that, it's not just the kind of fixed two-dimensional image that younger people are interested in, right? What they want to see are reels, right? What they want to see is just a tidbit of narrative. So I think, there are interesting formal questions there, like what is the difference? Like, why do you prefer a TikTok video or a reel, right, to say an image that you might, a fixed image? Like, what is it about the kind of movement, the kind of narrative, even if it's truncated, that draws your eye? And I also think that the same skills that they use when they're looking at, say, their friends at a football game, oh, look, they all went to this game, or they all went to this dinner party, or they're visiting their family, they can already read that. So to help them understand how to deploy those same critiques, why is her wig on back? Or why is she in front of a flat landscape? Why is the hair blonde and curly? That really fundamental questions like that, if they saw this and just paused with it on a social media platform, they would be piecing and parsing that out, so I think really a lot. And then, and then the next move obviously is to drag them back to the printed word, that the skills that you're using on TikTok and Instagram are the same skills that you can use with these photographs, current and historical, are the same interrogative skills that you can use with the words on the page. Because I think, at least I find this with my own students and my own kid, right, that there is a kind of exaggerated sense of the difference among and between those kinds of reading, and I just don't think they're that different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. And what you said in the beginning, we live in this iconic age, according to McLuhan, and the only thing we have to take care of, at least I think that coming from ELT, is that it is a different kind of decoding. It is a different form of reading, and we have to teach that and be aware of that, and maybe also lead our students into how to read those pictures, to photographies, and so on.
And also context. I'll just throw this in real quick, Matthias, before we get to you, is my I think I had mentioned this, but my husband is an editor of a Portuguese language journal, and there was a really fascinating article, and I should have published it, that pulled out her name and the name of the article, but it was a woman who had written on photographs of colonized spaces, Portuguese colonized spaces like Angola. And she had been going to flea markets and buying family albums. And she would pick up a family album from the 1970s, right? Because Angola was still, under Portuguese rule at that point. And she would pull out these family albums, and they would have pictures of, like, everybody at the Christmas tree, opening presents, the Portuguese family. And then embedded in that would be pictures of a soldier's family, right? And then embedded in that would be pictures of this same soldier sitting down with a nude, Native woman on his lap, and sort of finding the juxtaposition of these shocking images, right? We had the exploitation of, like, these women, these, colonized women's bodies, the Black female body, just sort of easily like, oh, here was Christmas, and here's when I went back to my job in Angola, and there was no sort of break that she saw among a number of these collections. One of the things I remembered this because I thought about sort of pulling the string of the collection in this talk, right? What happens when you take these frozen images and you put them in a story, and those are stories that were just, anyone who had a photo album in the 70s or went to a slideshow was just sort of putting in images from their life and experience. But the normalization of the sexualization of women in Angola through this photographic eye, and the fact that this was something that was so kind of not a big deal in the 70s, that it was just there in a photo album for sale at a flea market. If we saw that now, no, you know, I mean, we all, any viewer would immediately be horrified by the juxtaposition and the normalization of that. And so in moments when I think everything is getting worse, I actually think about those photo albums, right? And the kind of shock and horror that they elicit now that they wouldn't have elicited, you know, 50 years ago. Because I do think ways of seeing and the kind of critiques change, you know, like the pictures of things, you know, like even reading his accounts of showing the pictures, he's always just like, and then this lady touched me, you know, and I'm just like, ooh, you know, whereas that would have been a kind of wonderful thing to think about, you know, and all about the kind of authenticity and the beauty and the purity of women in the West, you know, but now from a 21st century perspective, we're like, I don't know how I feel about that, you know? So I do think there's a kind of evolution that comes out of context and reception that's also interesting in addition to the sort of actual images themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, thank you. Matthias.
Yeah, I would like to come back to your question of earlier on, Maria. How could we use these things in teaching language, or how could we introduce our students to that? I think it's striking to see the parallels and the similarity between the views of Synge as a writer and as a photographer. So, and even if you look at his photographs from the east of Ireland, Wicklow especially, and the few photographs of Dublin, compared to the ones he took on the Aran Islands, and if you compare the plays he wrote in, who are settled in the different places, for example, if you see the Playboy, you feel more part of the scene. And also, if you look at the photographs, you feel to be part of the community on the Aran Islands he shows in his photographs. And compared to the plays who are settled in Wicklow, for example, they are more smaller scenes and more intimate scenes. And also the view he has on the people of Wicklow, if you see the tramp on the roadside, for example, you can easily think, or you can, maybe you are not, it's not right, but you can easily imagine to find actually the scenes where the one-act plays are located. So I think it's striking to see the parallels between that. And the photographs are easily accessible, so you can use it in your teaching. And you can say, well, have a look at the photographs and have a look at the texts, at the plays. They are short enough to work with. And to see what comes out of this comparison between the two genres, the photography on one side and literature on the other side. So that would be maybe an interesting approach.
Yeah, because they do sort of create different kinds of realities. You know, I mean, I wish I don't actually know the answer to that. You know, I always go back to, you know, we were talking at the beginning of this about teaching, you know, online during COVID. And, you know, I was just like, I love teaching. It's like my favorite. I can't believe I'm lucky enough to be a teacher. I love talking about books it's the best job ever. And for me, everything that I loved about it was evacuated by doing it online. That makes no sense at all. Like, why was this thing that I have loved for a quarter of a century suddenly no fun when it was in 2 dimensions, right? On a video, you know? And I think, you know, it made me think a lot about sort of, and I still don't have an answer for that, you know, because and I think that was part of maybe what Welty and Synge were trying to puzzle out. You know, that yes, we look at these pictures and we feel something. Yes, we look at these pictures and they seem real. Yes, we look at these pictures and we feel a kind of connection to a world with which we were unfamiliar. You know, so it does stoke some kind of, as you say, feeling. I mean, you know, both Welty and Synge repeatedly use the word passion when they're talking about stuff around photographs. You know, that word keeps coming up. So there is an intensity of feeling that's stoked by that's different than the one that's stoked by reading. But I also think, as I said, I think what these plays in shared space and time were doing was trying to figure out why and how, right? Like, what do photographs do that literature doesn't do, the words on the page that performance doesn't do? You know, and I think we still really don't have answers to that. At least I know I don't. You know, I still, you know, I can say, oh, like this just doesn't feel as good. But the role that media plays in that and why that is, I think is something that we're still trying to puzzle out. And I think, for all the students that we talked to at the beginning of this class who are going into teaching, I mean, you were on the front lines of that. I mean, I was speaking with somebody, I was listening to talk about somebody who works on AI in the essay, and talking about sort of how AI is sort of changing student writing so rapidly. And he was saying, I think this means we're going to have to go back to oral exams, sitting in a room with a student and actually asking them questions and having them respond to it. So we're going to have to learn how to become better listeners. We're going to have to move more slowly, and we're going to have to use different kind of sensory modalities in order to both take in and express what we learn. And I thought that was a really provocative idea because, as you say, Matthias, these things are there and they're real and they're incredibly helpful. But how they're there and how they're real and how they're helpful, right, changes, I think, from generation to generation, right? The pictures stay the same, but the way that we read them changes so dramatically, both in form and content, that I think that becomes a really interesting point of discussion.
Yeah, it's all about interpretation. Yeah, that's it. Okay, I don't see any further hands, artificial or real hands. So yeah, finally, I have to thank you for this fantastic and really enthusiastic talk that we all enjoyed very much. And I hope you had some fun, even though we met virtually. And
yeah. Well, this is what I'm saying. Like, why is this fun? I mean, I say this all the time. I mean, at the risk of TMI, I'm like, I don't mind therapy online. Bring it. I don't mind work meetings online. I love these. I watch these all of the time from different, there's like, but I don't know. There was something about the pedagogical space with my undergrads that just,
yeah.
I don't know. And I still don't know why.
Yeah, and I think it's good because we can make use of that, and you don't have to travel to Germany all this way and back, etc., etc.
I'm not sure traveling to Germany would be a burden. Let me just put that out there. I think the problem would be getting me back home. Like, you would look into your closet and there I would be.
I understand. So thank you very much for this talk. And yes, I think we can call it a day. And thank you for the lively discussion and for everybody being here, joining us. And thank you very much for joining us, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.